I walked into the federal courtroom completely alone, representing myself against a man who could buy the judge twice over. My soon-to-be ex-husband Richard smirked from his side of the aisle, casually adjusting his custom Tom Ford tie. He leaned over to his shark of an attorney and whispered loud enough for me to hear that I was walking out of there with nothing but bus fare. The judge peered over his glasses and asked if I had any evidence to submit. I did not panic. I did not cry. I simply reached into my black leather tote bag and pulled out a worn red notebook. The moment Richard's attorney saw it all, the blood drained from his face. He actually panicked, shouting at the judge not to let me open it. The entire courtroom went dead silent. My name is Madeline. I am 33 years old and a forensic auditor who spent the last decade building my husband's empire from the ground up. Before I tell you exactly what was in that red notebook that brought a billionaire to his knees, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe if you believe that pushing a smart woman into a corner is the most dangerous mistake a man can make. The path to that courtroom began exactly 2 weeks earlier at the 10-year anniversary gala for Pierce Venture Capital. The ballroom at the Pierre Hotel was dripping with crystal and champagne filled with Wall Street elites celebrating Richard's genius. I stood near the back of the room, holding a glass of sparkling water, watching my husband accept the handshakes and the endless praise. To the rest of the world, Richard was a self-made visionary who turned a modest startup into a multi-billion-dollar investment firm. To me, he was the man who almost lost it all in year 2 because he could not balance a ledger to save his life. When his first round of funding was bleeding dry, I stepped in. As a forensic auditor, I know how numbers behave. I know how they hide, how they multiply, and how they expose the truth. I rebuilt his entire financial model, restructured his debt, and essentially saved him from going to federal prison for gross negligence. I gave him the foundation to build his empire. I spent my late 20s buried in spreadsheets and tax codes so he could stand on stages like this one and play the genius. Tonight was supposed to be our celebration, a quiet acknowledgement of the partnership that created this wealth. He had even promised me a special gift, a $250,000 diamond necklace he custom-ordered months ago. He told me it was lost in transit just the week before, but assured me the insurance claim was being processed and he would get me another one. I believed him because I was busy managing the actual numbers of our life, trusting him to manage our marriage. The lights dimmed, and Richard tapped the microphone on the center stage. The crowd fell silent, waiting for the great billionaire to speak. I smiled, expecting the obligatory nod to the woman who stood behind him. I did not need the spotlight, but I expected the respect. "Thank you all for being here tonight," Richard began, his voice echoing through the massive ballroom. 10 years ago, Pierce Venture Capital was just an idea. Today we manage portfolios that shape the future. But a visionary is nothing without the right people executing that vision. I waited for my name. I took a step forward, ready to offer a supportive smile to the crowd. "I want to bring someone up here who truly embodies the future of this firm," Richard announced. "Someone whose fresh perspective and brilliant vision has redefined who we are and where we are going. Please give a warm round of applause to our Vice President of Public Relations, Vanessa." I stopped breathing. Vanessa stepped onto the stage, waving demurely to the applauding crowd. She was 26 years old, freshly hired less than a year ago, and possessed a calculating ambition that I had warned Richard about. She walked with an exaggerated sway, her designer gown clinging to her figure. But that was not what made the floor drop out from under me. As she walked under the bright stage lights, something sparkled violently around her neck. I stepped closer, my analytical brain instantly matching the cut, the clarity, and the custom setting to the appraisal documents I had seen on Richard's desk just last month. It was the exact diamond necklace Richard had sworn was lost in transit. He had not lost it. He had wrapped it around the neck of his 26-year-old PR executive. My husband smiled at her, placing a hand on her lower back that lingered just a second too long, a second too intimately. The entire room clapped, completely oblivious to the public slaughter of my 10-year marriage happening right in front of them. The betrayal washed over me not in a wave of heated anger, but in a cold, clinical realization of the facts. The late nights at the office, the sudden business trips, the secretive phone calls, everything aligned perfectly into a pattern of infidelity. I did not scream or throw my drink. I am an auditor. When I find a discrepancy, I gather data before I react. I turned and walked toward the VIP lounge off the main ballroom, waiting for Richard to step off the stage. I needed to look him in the eye and see if he had the courage to admit what he had done. 5 minutes later, he walked in, stopping abruptly when he saw me standing by the mahogany bar. "There you are," he said smoothly, lacking even a trace of guilt. "I need to talk to you." I stared at him, my mind calculating the reality of what was happening. "You gave her my necklace?" I stated clearly, keeping my voice entirely devoid of emotion. I did not want to give him the satisfaction of seeing me break. Richard did not flinch. He did not deny it or offer an apology. Instead, he walked over to the leather sofa, picked up a thick manila folder, and dropped it onto the glass table between us. The heavy thud of the paper hitting the glass sounded like a gavel striking a block. "I am giving her a lot more than that, Madeline," he said, his voice laced with cruel amusement. "Those are divorce papers. I expect you to sign them by Monday." I looked at the folder, then back at the man I had spent a decade building up. A man whose debts I had cleared, whose reputation I had protected, and whose fortune I had secured. Why, I asked, simply needing to hear his justification. "Because you do not fit the image anymore," he said, adjusting his cuffs, as if we were discussing a corporate merger rather than our marriage. "I am running a multi-billion-dollar venture fund. I need someone young, vibrant, and socially dynamic by my side. You are a forensic auditor, Madeline. You are rigid, boring, and frankly, you make my investors uncomfortable with your constant questioning. You belong in the startup phase. You do not belong in the billionaire phase." His words were designed to break me, to make me feel small and disposable. He wanted me to cry, to beg, to ask what I could do to change his mind. He wanted to feel powerful by watching me shatter. But the moment he insulted my intellect and my profession, the last shred of my affection for him evaporated. I realized I was not looking at my husband anymore. I was looking at a hostile corporate entity trying to execute a hostile takeover of my life. He checked his Rolex, the one I bought him when we closed our first million. "I need to get back to my guests. Do not make a scene. Use the service elevator in the back to leave. My driver is waiting to take you back to the penthouse to pack. You have until midnight to get your things out of my house." "Your house?" I repeated, my tone sharpening. "We bought that penthouse together, Richard." He smirked, a cold, predatory expression that told me he had planned this down to the finest detail. "Read the papers, Madeline. You will find that my lawyers have been very thorough. Now, if you will excuse me, Vanessa is waiting for me to take her to the after-party." He turned and walked out of the room, leaving me standing alone with the divorce papers. The hum of the gala continued outside the door, a stark contrast to the absolute silence inside the VIP lounge. I slowly reached out and picked up the manila folder. I did not shed a single tear. I opened the file and began to read. Richard thought he had outsmarted me. He thought his team of high-priced lawyers could intimidate me into walking away quietly. He forgot one crucial detail. He had just handed his financial life over to a woman whose entire career was built on finding the hidden truth in the numbers. He wanted to play a game of assets and liabilities. I was going to show him exactly what a forensic auditor could do when she became the primary creditor. I took the service elevator exactly as Richard commanded. The descent was a metaphor too obvious to ignore. A private car drove me through the neon-lit streets of Manhattan in complete silence, dropping me off at the luxury high-rise that housed our penthouse. When I stepped out, the cold night air bit through my evening gown, but I barely registered the temperature. I walked into the grand lobby expecting to head straight up to the top floor. The concierge usually greeted me by name, but tonight he averted his eyes entirely, busying himself with a stack of mail. I approached the private elevator and pressed my thumb against the biometric scanner. A sharp red light flashed, followed by a harsh buzz. Access denied. I pressed my thumb down harder, ensuring the sensor was clean. Denied. He had scrubbed my fingerprint from the system before I even left the gala. "Good evening, Madeline," a slick voice echoed across the polished marble floor. I turned to see Bradley Thorne stepping out from the shadows of the seating area. Bradley was Richard's lead counsel, a man who charged $2,000 an hour to make other people's lives miserable. He wore a tailored charcoal suit that cost more than most vehicles and carried a smug, self-satisfied expression that made my stomach churn. At his feet sat two black, heavy-duty trash bags. "What is this, Bradley?" I asked, keeping my voice perfectly level. I refused to let my voice shake. "Richard works fast, Madeline," he replied casually, gesturing to the bags on the floor. "We had his assistant pack up some of your essentials, just the basics. Your designer items, the jewelry, the art collections, those were purchased with company funds and remain the exclusive property of Pierce Venture Capital pending asset division." I stared at the trash bags containing what I assumed were my oldest sweatpants and cheapest blouses. My husband had not just locked me out of the home I designed and managed, he had literally bagged my life up like garbage. I did not raise my voice or give Bradley the satisfaction of seeing me lose my composure. "I am legally entitled to enter my primary residence," I stated, citing the exact tenant and marital property laws of New York. "You cannot lock a spouse out without a court order." Bradley chuckled, an awful grating sound that echoed in the empty lobby. "Richard filed an ex parte motion an hour ago, citing severe emotional instability." The judge signed off immediately. "You know how these things go when you have the right connections and the right capital. You are officially trespassing if you try to go upstairs. I would hate to have to ask building security to physically remove you." He reached inside his expensive briefcase and pulled out a thick manila envelope, handing it to me. "This is a courtesy copy of the prenuptial agreement you signed 10 years ago. I strongly suggest you review it carefully before you try anything foolish or attempt to hire counsel you cannot afford." I opened the envelope and pulled out the crisp white pages. I remembered signing this document when I was 23 years old, desperately in love and completely naive to the brutal reality of immense wealth. Richard had told me it was just a standard formality to protect his initial investors and keep the board of directors happy. Now, reading the highlighted sections under the harsh lobby lights, the trap was glaringly obvious. It was an ironclad financial guillotine. "You see," Bradley continued, pacing slowly around me like a predator, "Richard does not actually own anything. His cars, his properties, his private jets, even his daily living expenses are tied up entirely in corporate entities and blind trusts. On paper, Richard Pierce is merely an employee of his own firm, earning a modest base salary for tax optimization purposes. All the real wealth is shielded behind a corporate veil. Therefore, there are absolutely no marital assets to divide. You cannot take half of something that technically does not exist." I scanned the dense legal jargon. It was a masterpiece of financial shielding. The agreement stipulated that upon dissolution of the marriage, any assets held by Pierce Venture Capital or its subsidiaries were strictly off-limits. I was entitled to nothing he had built, even though my uncompensated labor and financial modeling had saved those very assets from liquidation. The payout section was highlighted in bright yellow ink. "Upon divorce, the spouse shall receive a lump sum payment of $50,000 in lieu of all alimony maintenance and equitable distribution claims." $50,000. That was less than the catering bill for tonight's gala. It was an absolute insult, a deliberate slap in the face meant to remind me of my insignificance. Just then, the lobby doors slid open and Penelope walked in. She was Richard's younger sister, a woman whose entire existence was funded by nepotism and generational privilege. She carried a rare Himalayan Birkin bag and looked me up and down with utter disgust. Penelope had always hated me, because I came from a working-class family while she paraded around pretending to have royal blood. She never forgave me for making her brother actually work for his success in the early days, instead of just handing her blank checks to fund her endless shopping sprees. Well, look who is finally getting taken out with the trash, Penelope sneered, stopping next to Bradley. She pointed a perfectly manicured finger at the prenup in my hand. Take the check, Madeline. It is enough to buy a used Honda. Maybe you can drive it back to whatever cheap suburb you crawled out of and leave the real elite alone. I looked at Penelope, noting the expensive diamond watch on her wrist, a watch paid for by the company accounts I had organized and audited. I looked back at Bradley, who was grinning widely, smelling blood in the water. They wanted me to break. They wanted me to scream, cry, and throw a tantrum so they could point their fingers and call me crazy, validating Richard's fake ex parte motion. Instead, I carefully folded the prenup and slid it into my tote bag. I grabbed the heavy-duty trash bags, dragging them across the pristine marble floor. I did not say a single word to either of them. I walked out of the building with my head held high, leaving them to stand there in silence, wondering why I was not begging for mercy. I hauled the bags down the freezing street until I found a brightly lit bank ATM. The night wind whipped against my bare arms, but the adrenaline pumping through my veins kept me warm. I pulled out my debit card. If I was going to fight a billionaire in divorce court, I needed massive capital. I had my own personal savings account where I deposited my independent consulting fees before Richard insisted I stop working to manage his high society social calendar. I had over $80,000 saved. It was enough to hire a decent attorney to start filing discovery motions and challenge the prenup. I inserted the card and typed in my PIN. The screen buffered for a painfully long moment before flashing a bright red error message. Contact your financial institution. Account frozen. I frowned and pulled out my phone, opening my mobile banking application. Every single account was grayed out. My checking, my savings, even my old business account from years ago. The balances were all zeroed out with a glaring status reading pending legal review. My phone vibrated violently in my hand. It was a new voicemail from Richard. I pressed play, holding the speaker to my ear as city traffic rushed by on the busy avenue. Madeline Richards' voice was low, calculating, and completely devoid of the boyish charm he showed the public. I see you tried to access your accounts. Do not bother. I had my legal team file an emergency freeze this evening. We noticed a major discrepancy in the company books during an internal audit. It seems $200,000 is missing from the Pierce Venture Capital Charity Fund. And wouldn't you know it, the digital paper trail leads right to your personal accounts. My breath caught in my throat. Embezzlement. He was framing me for stealing from a charity foundation. It was a completely fabricated charge, but with his endless money and his corrupt tech team, he could easily falsify a digital trail long enough to ruin my life. He had created fake invoices and routed shell payments to make me look like a common thief. Richard's voicemail continued, his tone dripping with malice. You have two choices. You sign the non-disclosure agreement by Monday morning. You take the $50,000 and you walk away quietly forever. Or I will hand this fabricated evidence over to the district attorney and I will have you arrested for felony fraud. You will lose your CPA license, your professional reputation, and your freedom. Play smart, Madeline. You know you cannot win against me. The message ended with a sharp click. I stood on the sidewalk, the harsh wind blowing my hair across my face. My husband had orchestrated a flawless execution. He had locked me out of my home, stripped me of my financial assets, and manufactured severe criminal charges to ensure my absolute silence. He thought he had backed me into a corner so tight I would have no choice but to surrender unconditionally. He expected me to be a terrified, desperate housewife, willing to take whatever scraps he threw at me just to stay out of a prison cell. He forgot exactly who he was dealing with. I did not cry. I did not panic. I felt a profound, icy calm wash over my entire body. The kind of absolute clarity that only comes when you realize the rules of engagement have completely changed. Richard had just declared war, using finances as his weapon of choice. But finance was my battlefield. I spent years dissecting the fraudulent activities of corrupt executives before I ever met him. I knew exactly how to follow dirty money through the darkest webs of corporate deceit. Richard thought his wealth was perfectly shielded by his corporate entities. He thought his high-priced lawyers had created an impenetrable fortress around his billions. But every fortress has a structural flaw. Every system has a back door. And every billionaire has a dirty secret they are desperate to keep hidden from the IRS. If Richard wanted to play dirty, I would not just fight back. I would treat my own divorce like a forensic investigation, and I would dismantle his entire empire brick by brick. My analytical mind clicked into high gear, calculating my next strategic move. I picked up my trash bags and hailed a yellow cab, stepping into the warmth of the back seat. The game was officially on. I directed the cab driver to a cheap roadside motel in Queens, paying with the few wrinkled $20 bills I had stashed in my phone case for emergencies. The room smelled of bleach and stale smoke, a sharp downgrade from Egyptian cotton and panoramic city views. But I did not care. I barely slept. As soon as the sun rose, I walked to a rundown diner across the street. I needed a war room, and a sticky vinyl booth in the back corner would have to do. I ordered black coffee and asked the tired waitress for a pen. I grabbed a thick stack of thin paper napkins and began mapping out Pierce Venture Capital. I drew circles for the holding company, squares for the subsidiaries, and arrows, indicating the complex cash flow I remembered from auditing their quarterly reports years ago. I needed to find the exact point where Richard could bleed capital without triggering board oversight. I mapped out the management fees, the performance allocations, and the offshore investment vehicles. If Richard was hiding assets from a divorce court, he was hiding them from the Internal Revenue Service too. The bell above the diner door jingled loudly. I did not look up until a tall shadow fell over my table, blocking the morning light. A man slid into the booth opposite me, his movements smooth and deliberate. It was Jamal. He was an African-American tech genius, the chief technology officer of Pierce Venture Capital, and unfortunately for him, the husband of Richard's insufferable sister Penelope. Jamal wore a tailored navy trench coat that looked entirely out of place in this greasy spoon. He signaled the waitress for a coffee. His eyes locked on the chaotic web of corporate entities I had drawn on the napkins. "You are looking in the wrong place," Jamal said quietly, tapping a long finger on the napkin detailing the domestic subsidiaries. "Richard does not steal from the operational accounts. That is too obvious for a man trying to maintain a pristine Wall Street reputation." I stared at him, my guard instantly up. My analytical brain assessed every possible angle. "Did Bradley Thorne send you here to intimidate me?" I asked, keeping my voice cold and level. "Or did Penelope send you to make sure I am actually wearing the cheap clothes she packed in those trash bags?" Jamal let out a harsh, humorless laugh. "Penelope thinks I am at a morning board meeting with investors, and Richard thinks I am blindly loyal to the man who signs my exorbitant paychecks." He leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. The intensity in his dark eyes was unmistakable. "I despise your husband, Madeline. I despise his arrogance, and I despise the way he treats people as if they are disposable assets." I knew Richard was a textbook narcissist, but Jamal had a specific simmering anger that caught my immediate attention. "He makes you millions of dollars a year in stock options," I countered, testing him. "Why turn on him now? Why risk your own career?" Jamal's jaw tightened. "Because making him millions does not buy his respect. Behind closed doors, Richard constantly undermines my technical architecture. He makes sure the investors think the firm's algorithmic success is entirely his doing, while I am just the IT guy keeping the servers running. Worse than that, he makes subtle racist remarks wrapped up as corporate jokes. He thinks because he wears a bespoke suit and pays my salary, his bigotry is just harmless boardroom banter. He views me as the diversity hire who got lucky marrying his sister, not the architect of the trading platform that doubled his net worth. I felt a twist of disgust. Richard's entitlement truly knew no bounds. "And Penelope?" I asked. "How does your wife feel about her brother insulting you?" Jamal shook his head, a flash of deep regret crossing his face. "Penelope laughs at his jokes. She allows it. She enjoys the billionaire lifestyle too much to ever challenge her brother." I am filing for divorce next month, but I am not leaving empty-handed, and I am not letting Richard destroy the only person in that firm who actually built something real. He pointed directly at me. You and I built his empire, Madeline. You did the math, and I built the code. We are the only ones smart enough to tear it down before he crushes us both. I leaned back, assessing the man sitting across from me. If you are divorcing Penelope, Richard will use the exact same legal playbook on you. He will freeze your stock options, bury you in endless litigation, and claim your proprietary code belongs exclusively to Pierce Venture Capital. He will ruin your professional reputation, just like he is trying to ruin mine with these fake embezzlement charges. I know, Jamal said, his voice steady, which is why I need a forensic auditor. I have the technical access to the firm's backend, but I cannot prove the financial crimes to the Securities and Exchange Commission without someone who understands how to trace phantom capital. He reached into his coat pocket and slid a small, heavy object across the sticky table. It was a titanium USB drive. What is this? I asked, keeping my voice low. This is a heavily encrypted drive containing 3 years of raw server logs, Jamal explained. Richard has been moving massive amounts of company funds off the books for 3 years. He sets up shadow ledgers, transfers the capital to unknown destinations, and then orders me to wipe the server data completely so the board of directors never sees the deficit during their annual reviews. I felt a surge of pure adrenaline. This was exactly the kind of fatal flaw I was looking for. He ordered you to wipe the servers, I asked, confirming the magnitude of the violation. That is intentional destruction of corporate records. That is a serious federal crime. Exactly, Jamal nodded. He thinks he wiped the servers permanently. He thinks the digital paper trail is gone forever. But I kept a backdoor open in the system architecture. I mirrored the data to a secure offshore server before running his deletion protocols. I have every single deleted transaction. I picked up the cold titanium drive, feeling the weight of Richard's impending destruction in my palm. This was the smoking gun. The data is completely raw, Jamal warned, tapping the table. It is encrypted, disorganized, and buried under layers of dummy code that Richard had me design. I can get you the access, but I cannot translate the financial implications into a legal argument. You are the forensic auditor. You have to follow the money, find out exactly where he is hiding it, and prove it in court before he finalizes your divorce and ruins your life with those fake felony charges. I gripped the USB drive tightly. My mind was already calculating the extraction process. If Richard was siphoning capital off the books, he had to be washing it through a secondary vehicle. I needed to find the exact routing numbers. What about the encryption? I asked. I am an auditor, not a hacker. I cannot break military-grade security protocols. I will handle the initial decryption sequence, Jamal said, standing up from the booth. He adjusted his trench coat, scanning the diner to ensure no one was watching us. Check your secure email in exactly 2 hours for the access token. It will self-destruct 30 seconds after you open it, so be ready to input it immediately. After that, you are entirely on your own. Do not contact me on my personal phone. Do not try to meet me again. If Richard finds out we are working together, he will accelerate his timeline and have you arrested for the charity fraud today. I looked up at him, realizing the immense risk he was taking. Thank you, Jamal, I said sincerely. He is going to pay for what he did to both of us. Just follow the money, Madeline, Jamal said before turning away. Do not let him win. I watched him walk out of the diner and disappear into the bustling morning traffic of Queens. I looked down at the titanium drive resting next to my napkin diagrams. Richard Pierce thought he had outsmarted me by cutting off my access to the banking system. He thought locking me out of the penthouse and stealing my clothes would break my spirit. He drastically underestimated the danger of leaving a brilliant, angry woman alone with a laptop and the raw data of his darkest corporate sins. I left a $5 bill on the table for the coffee and headed back to my miserable motel room. The emotional betrayal of my 10-year marriage no longer mattered. This was a high-stakes financial thriller now, and I was ready to play my part. I pulled my laptop out of my bag and booted it up, staring at the harsh glare of the screen. I plugged the titanium USB drive into the port and waited for Jamal's email. I was going to follow the money straight into the heart of Richard's empire, and I was going to burn it to the ground. What would you do if you were handed the digital keys to your enemy's destruction? I sat cross-legged on the lumpy mattress of the Queen's motel room, staring at the glaring screen of my laptop. The digital clock in the corner of my screen ticked relentlessly. I had been waiting for exactly 1 hour and 59 minutes. My eyes burned from the lack of sleep, but the adrenaline pumping through my veins kept me hyper-focused. Jamal had said 2 hours. I refreshed my secure Proton Mail inbox. A new message popped up with no subject line containing only a string of alphanumeric characters. The access token. I copied the code immediately and pasted it into the decryption prompt on the titanium USB drive. Less than 10 seconds later, the email vanished from my inbox, completely wiped from the server just as Jamal promised. The progress bar on the decryption software filled up, turning solid green. Access granted. I was in. For the next 72 hours, I did not leave that cheap motel room. I survived on stale vending machine coffee and stale crackers, refusing to break my concentration. The data dump Jamal provided was a chaotic labyrinth of raw code server configurations and massive data tables. At first glance, Richard had done an exceptional job covering his tracks. The standard financial ledgers, the profit and loss statements, the balance sheets that the board of directors reviewed quarterly were immaculately clean. If a standard IRS auditor looked at these books, they would find absolutely nothing out of the ordinary. Everything balanced perfectly. But I was not a standard auditor. I was a forensic specialist trained to see the ghosts in the machine. I ignored the sanitized accounting software and bypassed the financial ledgers entirely. Instead, I dove straight into the raw server IP access logs. Financial data can be manipulated, but digital footprints are much harder to completely erase. I started filtering the data packets, looking for anomalies in the network traffic during off-peak hours. It took an agonizing amount of time running complex search queries through millions of lines of code. By the second night, my vision was blurring, but I finally caught a thread. Every Sunday morning at exactly 3 a.m., a highly encrypted server pinged the firm's main operational accounts. It was an automated script executing microtransactions. Richard was not moving large sums of money all at once. He was slicing off tiny fractions of the firm's daily trading profits, siphoning them out before they ever hit the official domestic ledgers. I grabbed my notepad and began tracing the destination IPs of those microtransactions. The money was being routed through a dizzying series of intermediary correspondent banks in Europe before vanishing into offshore jurisdictions. I followed the digital breadcrumbs straight into a massive labyrinth of shell companies. He had set up a complex nesting doll structure of corporate entities registered primarily in the Cayman Islands and the British Virgin Islands. I mapped out the network on the peeling wallpaper of the motel room using a red marker. There was an entity called Apex Horizon Limited, which owned a subsidiary called Zenith Global, which in turn was the sole shareholder of a trust registered in the Caymans. None of these entities listed Richard Pierce as a director or shareholder. They used nominee directors, local lawyers paid to put their names on the paperwork to shield the true beneficial owner. But the funding source was undeniable. The money was bleeding directly from Pierce Venture Capital. The sheer scale of the operation was staggering. Richard was routinely siphoning the 20% performance fees that his firm earned off the top, funneling the capital into these offshore black holes. He was executing a massive coordinated tax evasion scheme to hide his true net worth from the Internal Revenue Service. But as a forensic auditor going through a brutal divorce, I knew his secondary motive was far more personal. He was deliberately deflating his domestic assets to protect his wealth from the prenuptial agreement and any potential marital litigation. By making it look like his net worth was tied entirely to the fluctuating value of his firm, while simultaneously draining the actual cash offshore, he ensured that if I ever tried to fight him in court, he would appear paper poor. It was a brilliant, ruthless strategy. He was stealing billions of dollars and leaving no domestic trace. I kept digging, fueled by pure outrage and cold calculation. I needed to see exactly how much capital he had stockpiled in these offshore accounts. But as I tracked the final destination of the wire transfers, I hit a massive, impenetrable wall. The fiat currency did not stay in the Cayman bank accounts. The shell companies were acting as funnels, transferring the billions of dollars into unregulated cryptocurrency exchanges. I tracked the purchase orders. Richard had systematically converted over $1.5 billion into digital assets, primarily Bitcoin and Monero. My heart sank as the reality of the situation washed over me. Converting the stolen funds into untraceable cryptocurrency was the ultimate disappearing act. The blockchain is a public ledger, meaning anyone can see the transactions and the wallets holding the funds. I could sit there and look at the exact digital wallets holding $1.5 billion of stolen capital. But the blockchain is also entirely anonymous. There are no names, no social security numbers, and no corporate IDs attached to those wallets. They are just random strings of letters and numbers. I leaned back in the rickety motel chair, rubbing my temples. The evidence I had gathered from Jamal's USB drive was incredibly damning, but from a strictly legal standpoint, it was entirely circumstantial. If I walked into a federal court right now and slammed this data on the judge's desk, Richard's shark of a lawyer, Bradley Thorne, would destroy me. Bradley would simply argue that the offshore companies and the anonymous crypto wallets belong to foreign sovereign wealth funds or international tech investors. He would claim Richard was merely managing the trades on behalf of anonymous overseas clients. I could show the court the wallets, but I could not definitively prove Richard owned them. To prove ownership of a cryptocurrency wallet, you need the private keys. You need the specific 24-word seed phrase that acts as the ultimate password to access the funds. Without those private keys, the billions of dollars were just phantom numbers floating in cyberspace. Richard was a billionaire hiding behind cryptographic walls. He knew that even if a forensic auditor found the wallets, the authorities could never seize the assets without the seed phrases. I stared at the red marker diagrams covering the motel walls. The digital trail had ended. I could not hack a crypto wallet. Nobody could. The only way to get those private keys was to find where Richard had physically stored them. I needed tangible, undeniable proof linking my arrogant billionaire husband directly to those specific 24 words. If I wanted to crush Richard Pierce and watch his empire crumble to dust, I had to step away from the computer and hunt him in the real world. I sat on the edge of the motel bed, staring at the blank wall, running a complete psychological profile of the man I had married. I had to step away from the computer and hunt him in the real world because Richard Pierce possessed one massive, fatal flaw. Despite running a multi-billion-dollar tech venture fund, he was deeply pathologically paranoid about his own personal cybersecurity. He funded artificial intelligence and cloud computing startups, but behind closed doors, he refused to use password managers. He kept electrical tape permanently fixed over the camera lenses of his personal devices. He constantly lectured his executives about the vulnerabilities of digital storage, famously saying that anything stored on a server could eventually be subpoenaed, hacked, or stolen by a smart enough enemy. If Richard had systematically converted $1.5 billion of stolen company funds into untraceable cryptocurrency, I knew, with absolute certainty, that he did not store the private keys on a hard drive. He did not save them in a hidden folder on his encrypted phone. Those 24-word seed phrases were the only things granting him access to his stolen empire. He would demand physical control over them. He would write them down. Ink on paper. Cold storage. My mind raced through the possibilities. Where does a paranoid billionaire hide the physical keys to his illicit kingdom? A bank safety deposit box was too risky. Federal warrants could freeze bank assets in seconds, and Richard was terrified of the Securities and Exchange Commission. The Manhattan penthouse was too exposed. We had a small army of housekeepers, personal assistants, and maintenance staff constantly moving through those rooms. He would never risk a maid accidentally stumbling upon a piece of paper worth $1 billion. He would not hide it at his corporate headquarters, either knowing that a sudden board takeover or a disgruntled employee could compromise his office. It had to be a location entirely off the grid, a place completely disconnected from Pierce Venture Capital and his current high society life. It had to be a property he controlled absolutely, but one that could not be legally tied to his current corporate shielding strategy. Then the realization hit me with the force of a freight train. It was our old starter home. Right after college, before the private jets and the tailored suits, we were just two ambitious kids with a lot of debt and a big dream. We had purchased a dilapidated two-bedroom colonial in a quiet, forgotten working-class suburb in New Jersey. At the time, Richard's credit was completely destroyed from a failed early business venture. Because I had the pristine credit score and the steady accounting job, the mortgage and the deed were placed entirely in my sole name for tax and financing purposes. We bought that rundown house exactly 6 months before his venture fund secured its first major seed capital. And more importantly, we bought it before he ever shoved that draconian prenuptial agreement across the table. By strict legal definition, that New Jersey property was my sole separate pre-marital asset. Richard's ruthless corporate lawyers had not frozen it in the ex parte motion because it was completely outside the Pierce Venture Capital umbrella. It was practically invisible to his wealth managers. Yet Richard had vehemently insisted we keep the property even after we moved to Manhattan. He claimed it was a nostalgic real estate investment that would appreciate over time. He personally handled the property tax payments and refused to let me hire a management company to rent it out. He kept the only set of keys. He visited the empty house, occasionally feeding me lies about meeting contractors for renovations that never actually materialized. It was his ultimate physical blind spot. A property legally shielded from his business liabilities, technically owned by his wife but entirely under his physical control. I threw my laptop into my bag, grabbed my coat, and left the motel. I hailed a cab to a local rental car agency, paying cash for an unassuming gray sedan. I needed to be behind the wheel, completely untraceable, leaving no digital rideshare receipts for his lawyers to subpoena later. I drove across the bridge toward New Jersey, the gray morning sky perfectly matching the cold, calculated anticipation building in my chest. I navigated the familiar suburban streets until I pulled into the overgrown driveway of the colonial house. It looked miserable and abandoned. The paint was peeling, the lawn was a wild tangle of weeds, and the blinds were drawn tight across every window. It was the perfect invisible vault. I did not have a key, but I no longer cared about playing by the rules. I opened the trunk of the rental car, grabbed a heavy iron tire wrench, and marched straight to the back patio door. I swung the iron hard, shattering the glass pane into 1,000 glittering pieces. I reached through the jagged hole, unlocked the deadbolt, and stepped inside my own property. The air inside was stale and smelled of heavy dust. I walked through the empty, echoing rooms, ignoring the ghosts of our early marriage. I was not here for nostalgia. I headed straight down the narrow hallway to the small back room that Richard used to use as his home office. I stood in the center of the dim room, scanning the bare walls. My memory pulled up a highly specific, strange weekend from 4 years ago. Richard had abruptly canceled a luxury trip to the Hamptons, claiming he needed to personally fix a severe toxic mold issue in the drywall of this exact room. He had explicitly banned me from coming over to help, citing health hazards. He spent the entire weekend doing the drywall patching and painting himself. It was a completely absurd scenario for a billionaire who usually paid people just to open his car doors. I walked slowly toward the far wall, exactly where his heavy oak desk used to sit. I ran my fingers over the surface of the wall. To the naked eye, it looked perfectly normal. But under the light from my phone flashlight, I noticed the texture of the paint was a fraction of a shade lighter than the surrounding area. It was a perfect newly plastered square measuring about 2 feet across. I gripped the heavy tire wrench with both hands. I swung it with all the pent-up rage and betrayal of the last 2 weeks. The heavy iron smashed through the drywall with a loud crunch. I swung again and again, destroying the smooth surface white gypsum dust, raining down on my dark boots and coating my clothes. My heart hammered wildly against my ribs as I ripped the broken chunks of drywall away with my bare hands. A dark cavity was exposed between the wooden structural studs. I reached my arm deep into the dusty darkness, my fingers searching blindly until they brushed against something cold, hard, and heavy. I gripped a metal handle and pulled with all my strength. It was a solid steel, fireproof safe box. I hauled it out of the wall cavity and dropped it onto the dusty wooden floorboards with a heavy thud. The box was secured with a 4-digit mechanical combination dial. I knelt beside it, staring at the lock. Richard was a textbook narcissist. His ego dictated every single move he made, including his security measures. He lacked the imagination to use a truly random string of numbers. He would use something that celebrated his own perceived genius. I reached out and slowly rolled the metal dial to the exact month and year he incorporated Pierce Venture Capital, the moment he believed he became a god among men. The heavy steel mechanism clicked sharply. The lock was open. I took a deep breath, my lungs filling with the dusty air, and lifted the heavy lid of the safe. Inside the dark steel interior sat a single unassuming item, a worn red leather-bound notebook. I pulled the notebooks out. My hands were visibly shaking, not from fear, but from the sheer magnitude of what I was holding. I opened the thick leather cover and flipped to the first page. There they were. Written in Richard's unmistakable sharp handwriting were line after line of carefully documented words. They were the 24-word seed phrases, the exact cryptographic keys to the Cayman Island digital wallets holding $1.5 billion of stolen funds. I recognized the corresponding public wallet addresses I had traced on my laptop just hours earlier. By holding this physical notebook, I now held absolute, undeniable control over his entire hidden fortune. He could not deny ownership when his own handwriting spelled out the keys to the vault. But Richard's arrogance did not stop at cryptocurrency. I flipped toward the middle of the notebook, expecting to find more digital keys. Instead, the breath was completely knocked out of my lungs. It was a physical, handwritten ledger. Columns of names, specific dates, offshore bank routing numbers, and exact dollar amounts filled the pages. But these were not corporate expenses or venture capital investments. I recognized the names immediately. They were prominent state officials, regulatory commissioners, and influential local politicians. It was a master list of bribes. Richard had systematically documented millions of dollars in illegal payouts to politicians who had conveniently looked the other way, fast-tracked his zoning permits, and ignored his blatant regulatory violations while he built his unregulated financial empire. He had kept a physical record of his blackmail material, ensuring he always had leverage over the most powerful people in the state. He thought this red notebook made him untouchable. He thought storing his most damning secrets offline in a hollow wall of a forgotten house guaranteed his absolute safety. He was wrong. This notebook was not just the ultimate leverage for my divorce. It was a master list of severe federal crimes. It was undeniable proof of massive tax evasion, corporate embezzlement, wire fraud, and political bribery. It was a ticking time bomb that could obliterate Pierce Venture Capital and send my arrogant, mocking husband to a federal penitentiary for the rest of his natural life. I closed the red leather cover, the soft slap of the pages sounding louder than a gunshot in the empty house. I tucked the notebook safely into the inner zip pocket of my coat. I stood up, dusting the white plaster off my knees, and walked out of the broken house without looking back. Richard Pierce had challenged a forensic auditor to a war over assets, and I had just seized the nuclear launch codes. The path to that exact moment required absolute precision. I had walked through the heavy mahogany doors of the federal courthouse in downtown Manhattan, feeling like a gladiator stepping onto the sand. I had no high-priced legal team flanking my sides. I was acting as my own counsel, representing myself pro se. In high-stakes billionaire divorce litigation, showing up without a lawyer usually signals complete desperation and imminent defeat. Today, it signaled absolute lethal control. Richard was already seated at the respondent's table, looking like a man attending a minor corporate inconvenience rather than an emergency asset discovery hearing. He radiated pure, unadulterated arrogance. In the gallery directly behind him sat Vanessa. She was practically draped over the wooden bench, wearing a prominent emerald ring that my forensic memory immediately flagged from a recent company expense report filed under corporate gifting. Penelope sat next to Vanessa, leaning over to whisper something that made them both snicker as I walked down the center aisle. They thought I was walking to my slaughter. They firmly believed that the frozen bank accounts and the fabricated embezzlement charges had broken my spirit. They expected me to beg for the $50,000 settlement and sign the non-disclosure agreement just to avoid a fabricated prison sentence. Judge Carter presided over the hearing. She was a no-nonsense jurist with a reputation for moving complex financial cases quickly and showing zero tolerance for courtroom theatrics. The proceedings began with the standard discovery protocols. Bradley Thorne stood up, smoothing his expensive silk tie, and approached the bench with the swagger of a man who owned the entire judicial system. "Your Honor," Bradley began, his voice dripping with faux sympathy, "we are here today to expedite this unfortunate dissolution of marriage. My client Richard Pierce wishes to be entirely transparent with the court regarding his financial standing. As we have previously outlined in our ex parte motions, the marital estate is virtually non-existent." Bradley handed a thick stack of stapled papers to the bailiff, who promptly passed it up to the judge. Another copy was unceremoniously dropped onto my empty table. "I present Mr. Pierce's sworn financial affidavit," Bradley stated proudly, ensuring his voice carried to the gallery. "As the documents clearly show, my client's vast wealth is a complete illusion created by the sensationalist financial press. His actual net worth is approximately $8 million, heavily leveraged against severe corporate debts and outstanding venture liabilities. All major operational assets are shielded within corporate entities that entirely predate this marriage. Therefore, there are no liquid marital assets to distribute beyond the $50,000 lump sum we generously offered the petitioner earlier this week." I stared at the affidavit resting on my table. I did not even bother opening the cover page. I knew exactly what it contained. It was a masterpiece of creative accounting, a beautifully constructed legal lie designed to make a billionaire look like a struggling mid-level manager drowning in debt. By submitting this document under oath, Bradley and Richard were legally swearing to the federal government that these numbers represented the absolute entirety of Richard's global wealth. "Do you have any objections to the financial affidavit, Ms. Hayes?" Judge Carter asked, looking down at me with a mix of professional curiosity and mild pity. I stood up, my posture perfectly straight. "I do, Your Honor. I believe the affidavit is materially false and intentionally deceptive. I would like to call the respondent to the stand for direct cross-examination regarding his declared assets." Bradley let out a sharp, patronizing laugh, shaking his head. "Your Honor, the petitioner has no legal counsel and zero material evidence to contradict a certified financial declaration prepared by top-tier accountants. She is merely attempting to waste the court's valuable time out of sheer spite. I have the absolute right to question the respondent under oath regarding his submitted financial disclosures," I countered, maintaining a clinical, icy tone. "Unless Mr. Thorne is afraid his client cannot verify his own basic arithmetic." Richard scoffed loudly from his table, adjusting his suit jacket. "Let her ask her questions, Bradley. I have absolutely nothing to hide from my soon-to-be ex-wife." Richard confidently strode up to the witness stand, taking the oath with a theatrical raise of his right hand. He sat down, crossing his legs, and fixed me with a gaze of pure condescension. He was ready to play the victimized businessman, indulging his hysterical, bitter wife. I picked up a legal pad containing exactly 0 notes and walked slowly toward the podium. I did not raise my voice. I spoke with the precise surgical cadence of a forensic auditor conducting a hostile corporate interview. "Mr. Pierce," I began, holding his gaze, "you just swore under penalty of perjury that this financial affidavit represents a complete and accurate accounting of your global assets. Is that correct?" That is absolutely correct, Madeline, Richard answered, leaning back in his leather chair. Every single cent is accounted for. I see. I paced slightly to my left, ensuring I had the full attention of the judge and the court reporter. Let us talk about your corporate structural mapping. Does Pierce Venture Capital currently own or operate any subsidiary holding companies registered in the Cayman Islands or the British Virgin Islands? Richard blinked, a microscopic flicker of annoyance crossing his face. No, we operate strictly within domestic regulatory frameworks. Any offshore activity is handled entirely by third-party independent contractors. I nodded slowly, pretending to process his blatant lie. So you have no personal or professional financial interest in an offshore entity known as Apex Horizon Limited? Bradley Thorne shifted uncomfortably in his seat at the mention of the specific shell company, but Richard maintained his arrogant facade. I have never heard of them. Richard lied smoothly, leaning closer to the microphone. What about Zenith Global? I pressed, firing the next name immediately without giving him a second to breathe. Do you or your firm use Zenith Global to transfer executive performance fees out of your domestic operational accounts to avoid state and federal tax liabilities? Objection, Bradley barked, leaping out of his chair. Relevancy. The petitioner is throwing out random corporate names to create an unauthorized fishing expedition. Overruled. Judge Carter said, her eyes narrowing as she looked back at Richard. The witness will answer the question. No. Richard said, his voice tightening just a fraction. I do not use Zenith Global. I do not hide money. I let the silence hang in the cold courtroom for exactly 3 seconds. I needed him to commit to the perjury completely, utterly, and inescapably. Mr. Pierce, I said, stepping closer to the witness stand and lowering my voice. I want to be incredibly clear before we move forward. Are you stating under oath before this federal judge that you do not possess any hidden offshore accounts and that you hold absolutely no assets in the form of cryptocurrency? Richard let out a short, mocking laugh that echoed through the high ceilings of the courtroom. He looked at Vanessa in the gallery, rolling his eyes as if I were a foolish child asking about imaginary fairy tales. I do not own any cryptocurrency, Madeline, Richard said, smiling a sharp, predatory smile. I do not have hidden offshore accounts. The affidavit my team submitted is completely accurate. You are grasping at straws because you cannot accept the reality of our prenuptial agreement. I have absolutely nothing else to disclose. The trap was fully set. The steel jaws had just slammed shut over his ankles. Richard Pierce had officially committed perjury in a federal courtroom. I turned my back on him and walked calmly back to my table. I reached into my black leather tote bag. The leather felt cool against my fingertips as I bypassed my pens and empty legal pads. My hand wrapped around the worn, textured cover of the item I had excavated from the drywall of our old New Jersey home. I pulled out the red notebook. I did not wave it around theatrically. I simply held it in my right hand as I turned back to face the judge. Your Honor, I said, my voice slicing through the quiet room like a surgical blade. I would like to submit Exhibit A into the public record. This is a handwritten physical ledger documenting the respondent's massive unlisted assets. Bradley Thorne frowned, squinting at the worn red cover from across the room. Richard leaned forward in the witness box, his confident smirk freezing into a mask of pure confusion. He did not recognize the notebook from the outside, but he knew exactly what he had hidden inside the walls of our old house. I opened the notebook to the first page. I did not look at Richard. I looked directly at the court reporter, ensuring every single syllable I spoke was permanently transcribed into the official federal record. This ledger, I began reading clearly and deliberately, contains the exact 24-word seed phrases and public wallet addresses for over $1.5 billion in untraceable Bitcoin and Monero. These wallets are directly funded by automated wire transfers originating from Zenith Global and Apex Horizon Limited. I read the first 12 alphanumeric characters of the primary Cayman Island routing number out loud. I enunciated every letter and number with pristine, razor-sharp clarity. The color instantly drained from Richard's face. He turned a sickening shade of chalk white. His mouth fell open, but absolutely no sound came out. He stared at the red notebook in my hand, as if I were holding a live explosive device. He knew exactly what was written on the next page. He knew about the handwritten master list of political bribes. Bradley Thorne was a ruthless courtroom shark, but he was not an idiot. He was a veteran financial attorney who knew exactly what those offshore routing numbers meant. He knew the devastating apocalyptic implications of a cryptocurrency seed phrase being read into a public court transcript. If those 24 words became public record, the assets could be seized by anyone watching. More importantly, if this notebook was admitted into evidence, the Internal Revenue Service and the Securities and Exchange Commission would immediately launch a joint federal investigation. Bradley realized in a fraction of a second that his billionaire client had completely lied to him. Richard had used him to submit a completely fraudulent financial affidavit under oath. Bradley was now an unwitting accessory to federal perjury and massive financial fraud. His license to practice law, his freedom, and his entire lucrative career were about to evaporate. As I took a breath to read the first word of the highly classified crypto seed phrase, Bradley Thorne completely lost his mind. He leaped out of his chair, knocking it backward to the floor with a loud, jarring crash. His face was slick with sudden, terrified sweat. "Do not open that!" Bradley screamed, his voice cracking with absolute, uncontrolled panic. He threw his hands up frantically, gesturing toward me, as if trying to physically block the words from reaching the court reporter. "Stop reading." Judge Carter banged her gavel, sharply glaring at the defense table with visible shock. "Mr. Thorne, control yourself. What is the meaning of this unprecedented outburst?" Bradley was hyperventilating, looking wildly from the judge to the red notebook, and then down at Richard, who was practically hyperventilating in the witness box. In the gallery, Vanessa sat frozen, her designer purse slipping from her lap to the floor with a thud. Penelope had dropped her phone entirely, her mouth hanging open. "Your Honor," Bradley gasped, gripping the edge of his table to steady his violently shaking hands. "We request an immediate recess. Right now. We need an immediate recess for urgent settlement negotiations." I snapped the red notebook shut, the sound echoing loudly in the stunned courtroom. I looked at Richard Pierce, the billionaire who had tried to throw me out like garbage, who had frozen my bank accounts and threatened me with federal prison. He was staring at me with a look of absolute sheer terror. He finally realized that the woman he tried to destroy was the one holding the match to his entire world. Judge Carter struck her gavel against the sounding block, granting a 20-minute emergency recess. The heavy oak doors of the courtroom swung open, and the bailiff directed us into a sterile, windowless arbitration room down the main corridor. I walked in first, taking a seat at the head of the long conference table. I placed my black leather tote bag neatly on the floor. Richard staggered into the room a few seconds later, leaning heavily against the doorframe, as if all the oxygen had been vacuumed from his lungs. Bradley Thorne followed closely behind him, quickly locking the heavy door and pulling the blinds shut. Bradley was sweating so profusely that dark patches had bloomed across his expensive charcoal suit jacket. The silence in the room was absolute and suffocating. Richard slumped into a chair across from me, loosening his Tom Ford tie with trembling fingers. The arrogant billionaire facade had completely evaporated. He looked like a cornered animal, realizing the trap was perfectly inescapable. "What do you want?" Madeline Richard choked out his voice, barely a raw whisper. "How much money will it take for you to hand over that notebook and walk away?" I reached into my bag and pulled out the insulting prenuptial agreement he had forced on me. I dropped it onto the center of the table. Then I placed the red leather notebook directly on top of it. "You misunderstand the situation, Richard," I said, my voice ice-cold and perfectly steady. "I am not here to negotiate a settlement based on your fake corporate shielding. I do not want 50% of your imaginary domestic assets. I want everything you actually value." Bradley Thorne leaned forward, his eyes locked entirely on the red notebook. "Name your terms, Ms. Hayes. Just name them." I opened a sleek black folder I had prepared over the last 72 hours, using the raw data Jamal had provided. I slid 3 distinct legal contracts across the polished wood table. "My terms are non-negotiable," I stated plainly. First, I want 80% of all global liquid assets, including the hidden Cayman Island accounts and the offshore cryptocurrency wallets. Second, I require the immediate, irrevocable transfer of 100% of your voting shares in Pierce Venture Capital directly to my name. Third, I want your signed binding resignation as Chief Executive Officer of the firm effective this exact minute. Richard stared at the contracts, his jaw dropping in absolute horror. "You are out of your mind," he gasped, slamming his fist weakly against the table. "I built that firm. I am the face of that company. You cannot just take my entire life." I leaned forward, resting my arms on the table, looking straight into his panicked eyes. "I can and I will, Richard. Because if you do not sign every single page of those contracts right now, I am walking back into that courtroom and submitting this notebook into the public record." Within an hour, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the Internal Revenue Service, and the Securities and Exchange Commission will freeze your entire global network. You will be indicted for massive tax evasion, corporate embezzlement, wire fraud, and the bribery of state officials. You will lose the firm anyway, but you will also spend the next 20 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary, eating powdered eggs and wearing an orange jumpsuit. I shifted my gaze to his attorney. "And Mr. Thorne here will be disbarred and prosecuted for submitting a fraudulent financial affidavit under oath." Bradley Thorne swallowed hard, his face a mask of pure terror. He turned to his billionaire client, his voice desperate and urgent. "Sign it, Richard. Sign the damn papers right now. If she hands that notebook to the judge, I go down for perjury and you go to prison for decades. There is no legal loophole here. She has the physical proof. Sign whatever she wants." Richard looked from the contracts to his lawyer and back to me. His chest heaved as the reality of his total destruction settled over him. He was completely trapped. I had used his own paranoia and greed to build a cage he could never escape. With hands shaking so violently he could barely hold his expensive fountain pen. Richard leaned over the table. He signed his name over and over again, transferring his liquid wealth, his voting power, and his entire empire into my control. When he finished the last signature, the pen slipped from his fingers and clattered onto the floor. I gathered the signed contracts, slipping them safely into my folder alongside the red notebook. I stood up, smoothing my skirt. "You have until 5 o'clock today to clear your personal items out of the corporate office," Richard I said cleanly. "The Human Resources Department will be expecting your departure." I turned and walked out of the negotiation room, leaving the two broken men sitting in the sterile silence. When I stepped back out into the wide marble hallway, Vanessa was pacing nervously near the gallery doors. Her designer heels clicked sharply against the floor. As soon as Richard stumbled out of the arbitration room looking pale, hollow, and utterly defeated, she rushed up to him, grabbing his arm. "What happened?" Vanessa demanded, her voice high-pitched and anxious. "Why did we stop the hearing? How much did you have to pay her to go away?" Richard did not even look at her. He stared blankly ahead, his voice a dead, empty monotone. "I have nothing. I signed it all over. I resigned. She took the firm, Vanessa. I am broke." Vanessa froze. Her manicured hands slowly slipped off his arm. The sweet, devoted facade she had worn all morning dropped instantly, replaced by a cold, calculating disgust. "You are broke," she repeated, the word tasting like poison on her lips. "You are unemployed." Without another word, without a single glance of sympathy or comfort, Vanessa turned on her heel and walked straight out of the federal courthouse, leaving the man she supposedly loved standing entirely alone in the massive corridor. She was an opportunist, and the opportunity had just bankrupted itself. I watched the entire exchange with a calm, detached satisfaction. Then I noticed Penelope standing near the courtroom doors, clutching her rare Himalayan Birkin bag. She had heard everything. Her face was contorted in absolute shock as she stared at her brother's ruin. I walked directly up to her. Penelope stared at me, her arrogant sneer completely wiped away by fear. "Penelope," I said, my tone sharp and authoritative, "go back to headquarters and clean out your desk immediately. Pierce Venture Capital no longer employs you. Your severance package consists of whatever loose change you can find in the lobby sofas." She opened her mouth to argue, but no words came out. I walked past her, pushing open the heavy glass doors of the courthouse and stepping out into the bright, crisp Manhattan afternoon. I hailed a cab and headed straight to the corporate headquarters I now officially owned. The transition of power was swift and absolute. Within 24 hours, the board of directors had been notified of my majority voting control and Richard's sudden resignation. The corporate atmosphere shifted immediately from a toxic boys' club to a highly efficient meritocracy. I took over the massive corner office on the top floor of the glass skyscraper. The space was sleek, modern, and entirely mine. I sat behind the expansive mahogany desk organizing the transition files when there was a firm knock on the glass door. Jamal walked in wearing a sharp-tailored suit carrying a tablet filled with operational data. He looked around the executive office, a slow, triumphant smile spreading across his face. I stood up and handed him a freshly printed corporate directive. "I had the legal department draft this up this morning," I said, watching him scan the document. "Congratulations, Jamal. Effective immediately, you are the new Chief Executive Officer of Pierce Venture Capital." Jamal looked down at the official executive order. The man who had built the algorithms, generated the profits, and endured years of subtle bigotry and disrespect was finally holding the ultimate authority. He looked up at me, his dark eyes shining with profound respect and gratitude. "We make a formidable team," Madeline, Jamal said, extending his hand. "We certainly do," I replied, shaking his hand firmly. "Lead the company well, Jamal." I walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows standing in my new office and looked down at the sprawling, bustling city below. I had entered this battle with nothing but a trash bag of cheap clothes and a frozen bank account. I was leaving it as the majority shareholder of a billion-dollar empire, having entirely dismantled the man who tried to erase me. I took a deep breath of the crisp, high-altitude air, enjoying the absolute, unshakable peace of complete victory. Never push a woman with a forensic mind into a corner. She won't just find your skeletons, she'll use them to buy your house. Have you ever caught a liar in their own trap? Tell me your story in the comments below and hit subscribe for more stories of women taking back their power. The most powerful lesson from Madeline's story is that your greatest weapon is your own expertise. When her manipulative husband tried to strip away her dignity and financial security, she didn't crumble. Instead, she weaponized her forensic skills to completely dismantle his corrupt empire. This reminds us that true power doesn't come from someone else's bank account or a draconian contract. It stems from intellect, preparation, and knowing your absolute worth. When you refuse to be a victim, you rewrite the rules. Share a time you used your unique skills to overcome a toxic situation and comment below.